Hello everyone and welcome to another middle game episode with Coach B and masteryourchess.com. In this video we're going to take a look at the bishop in the middle game. Historically, bishops have been viewed as either a good bishop or a bad bishop. Good bishops were referred to bishops that stand on the opposite color as your pawns in the center, and bad bishops were referred to bishops that stand on the same color as your pawns in the center. Now many times, even bad bishops can often be active and very strong, or critically useful defenders. Therefore, in this video series, we're going to refer to the bishops in three categories. We're going to refer to bishop as active, useful, or just tall pawns. So let's take a look at a couple of examples for each of those types. So first, let's talk about the active bishop. If a bishop has a free diagonal that it's not cluttered by its own pawns or a solid, well-defended wall of enemy pawns, then it's considered an active bishop. Now, if you have pieces on that diagonal, they are not considered clutter, as those pieces can move away, freeing up the diagonal for the bishop. In this first position, white has two active bishops here. The c4 bishop eyes the f1 to a6 and the a2 to g8 diagonal, while his other bishop patrols the c1 to h6 line. Black's light square bishop is also active since it eyes the c8 to h3 diagonal. Again, the knight on d7 isn't considered clutter because it can move out of the bishop's way whenever it wishes to. However, Black's e7 bishop isn't particularly active because it's blocked by this d6 pawn. Of course, it does keep an eye on the shorter d8 to h4 diagonal, and it also gives d6 solid support, so it's not close to being what we call a tall pawn. In fact, this bishop can easily become active after a move something like d5, and here if white exchanges the pawns and after c takes on d5 and white retreats the bishop on e7 now it's super active. And taking on d5 would be met with knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and after knight f6 hitting the bishop has to retreat, let's say bishop to c4, and then e takes d4 will reach a similar position. So you could see how just a single move and an innocent pawn exchange can turn a piece into a super active one. Coming back, why are all these bishops in this diagram reasonably active? Well, it's because the center is fluid and can open further if pawns are exchanged. However, a couple of poor moves can change all of this. For example, if Black plays here something like c5, here you could see that the dark square bishop is trapped, and I'm pretty sure that he doesn't appreciate this move. This unfortunate advance also turns d5 into a gapping hole. Now, if white responds with d5, this is also a really bad move. White also seems to be oblivious to the need of his minor pieces. With one push of the pawn, the d5 hole has been plugged and the c4 bishop is blocked now. Coming back after c5, a better reply for white here would be d takes on e5. After knight takes e5 and knight takes e5, d takes e5 and queen to e2 would leave Black with the hole on d5, while the e7 bishop's potential has been greatly reduced. Also notice that white's light square bishop is a real weapon on the a2 to g8 diagonal. As a rule, every time you move a pawn, check to see how it affects the activity of your bishops. Obviously, turning an open position into a closed one will have a serious effect on these pieces. So train yourself before making any pawn moves to always take in consideration the activity of your bishops. Bishops are usually strongest in open positions. The fewer the pawns in the way of a bishop, the greater its role and its activity. Next, we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of a useful bishop. This next game was played by two students rated 1827 and 1732. If we look at this position, one would think that white should stand better here. White's bishop is clearly more active than Black's bishop on d7. The e6 pawn is weak and it's being attacked by two rooks. And the e5 square is a hole in the middle of the board. And here white even has the move. Yet things aren't so clear. It turns out that white's d pawn isn't as safe as one might suppose. While white also has to deal with the threat of rook takes f3. shattering white's king position. This can be dealt with rook to e3 or knight to e5. So looking at all of this, isn't white better after all? Well, to find the answer to this, we need to address the bishops. It turns out that white's active bishop isn't really helping the rest of its forces deal with rook takes on f3, with the weakness on e5, or its own slightly loose pawn on d4. While black's bishop on d7 is protecting the e6 pawn, which is being attacked by two rooks, and you could look at it as the bishop holding off two enemy rooks. Once e6 is no longer a threat, the bishop on d7 could move around his pawn chain to a more active diagonal to support his troops into a common goal. In the actual game here, white played the move knight to e5. If he would have moved rook to e3, here black could have taken on f3. After rook takes f3, rook takes back, bishop to e2, pinning the rook to the queen. Rook takes on f2, pinning the bishop to the queen. If the bishop takes black's queen, then black can take the white queen on d2. After king takes f2 and queen to h4 check, king g1, queen takes d4, queen exchange, knight takes d4. This is a winning position for black with the two center pawns, the king, bishop, and knight fighting together. One of those pawns would have been promoted. So coming back after knight d5, black responded with knight takes e5 as well. I want to mention that knight takes d4 was not good here. After bishop to g6, knight takes e2, rook takes e2. Coming back, black here took on e5, and white responded with the correct rook takes e5. You definitely don't want to take here with the pawn on d4. Now you filled in the hole on e5. It turns d5 into a pass pawn, and it also blocks both of white's rooks. Remember, you want to make moves that do good things in your position, not good things for your opponent. So after rook takes e5, black responded with queen to h4, rook 1 to e2, queen f4, rook 5 to e3, queen g5, g3, queen to h5. After white plays king to h2, black's got e5, and now we want to play d takes e5. Definitely not rook takes e5. After rook takes e5, the queen could take on h3, king to g1, and then bishop to g4 with the winning position. So coming back after d takes e5, queen takes h3 check, king to g1, d4, rook to e4, rook to f3, bishop c4 check, king h8, queen to e1, d3, rook d2, and bishop to c6. You could see that black's bishop, which was once a useful defender, is now a fierce attacker. From here, I'm just going to skim through the moves, and this position actually ended up in a draw because of a threefold repetition that white cannot get out of. Next, we're going to talk about a bishop as a tall pawn. A bishop is said to be a tall pawn if it's not serving a useful function as it's trapped behind its pawns, thus making it inactive. So here's a clear example. In this example, even though white is up a minor, he's totally losing. After something like c3, takes on c3, king to c4. After bishop to g1, a3, bishop h2, a2, king b2, promoting and then taking the queen. Black captures on c3, and then there's nothing that white can do to prevent black from taking the bishop and also being able to promote his pawn in winning the game. And coming back after c4, here if instead of moving the bishop to g1, the white king moves to b2, this doesn't help either. After a3, king takes on a3, king takes c3, king a4, king d3, king b4, king e2, bishop to g1, king f1. The same type of game it's going to be reached, and black will promote his pawn and win the game from here. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.